In 36 hours, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed more than 17,000 structures over 3.3 square miles. It killed about 300 people and left 100,000 homeless, a third of the city's population. These devastating numbers might have seemed like a leveling of the ground, a fair start, but the truth was quite the opposite. The disaster was not a great leveling, but a calculated redistribution of power. The fire gave the elite a golden opportunity to create a new Chicago of their own, while relief and planning policies pushed the poor and immigrant communities to the margins. Before it was a metropolis, Chicago was a swamp. The native Potawatomi people called the area Chicaquah for the wild onion-like leeks that grew in the marshland along the riverbank. For centuries, it was little more than a muddy, windswept portage point, a soggy strip of land connecting the great water systems of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. The first permanent settlement of note, established by Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable in the 1780s, was a humble trading post. The founding of Fort Dearborn in 1803 gave the location a flicker of strategic importance, but for decades it remained a remote, uninviting frontier outpost, clinging precariously to the edge of a vast, empty prairie. The men and women who first saw it would have found the idea of a great city rising from that mud laughable. The land was flat, featureless, and so low-lying that it barely cleared the waters of Lake Michigan. Spring rains turned the entire area into an impassable quagmire. Yet it possessed one undeniable world-altering feature: location. It was the perfect pivot point for a nation that was exploding westward. The first great catalyst was the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, which connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean via New York City. Suddenly, the interior of the continent was open for business. But the true Big Bang for Chicago was the arrival of the railroad. In 1848, a single locomotive named the Pioneer chugged out of the fledgling city on the tracks of the New Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. It was the beginning of an iron flood. Within a decade, Chicago had become the undisputed railroad capital of the United States. Dozens of rail lines converged on the city, fanning out like iron tentacles in every direction. It became the singular point where the raw materials of the West, grain from the plains, lumber from the great northern forests of Wisconsin and Michigan, and livestock from the vast cattle ranges, were gathered, processed, and shipped to the hungry markets of the East and the world. This geographic destiny ignited a period of growth so rapid it defied comprehension. In 1840, Chicago was a town of just over 4,000 people. By 1850, it was nearly 30,000. By 1860, it had exploded to over 112,000. And by the eve of the Great Fire in 1871, its population had tripled again to more than 334,000 souls. It was the fastest growing city on earth. This was not merely growth, it was a frantic, chaotic explosion of human energy. The city's entire existence was predicated on speed and volume. Everything had to be bigger, faster, and more profitable than the year before. The Chicago Board of Trade, established in 1848, standardized the buying and selling of grain, inventing the modern system of futures contracts and turning agricultural products into abstract commodities that could be traded in a frenzy. Colossal grain elevators, dubbed cathedrals of commerce, towered over the river, capable of loading an entire freight train in a matter of hours. The Union Stockyards, opened in 1865 on the city's south side, was a city unto itself, a square mile of pens, slaughterhouses, and packing plants that processed millions of cattle and hogs a year. It was the hog butcher for the world, a brutal and efficient engine of protein production that fed the nation. Innovators like Cyrus McCormick built massive factories, producing the mechanical reapers that made the cultivation of the Western Plains possible. Chicago wasn't just on the frontier, it was actively creating it, processing it, and selling it. The spirit of the city was one of relentless, unapologetic boosterism. Chicagoans saw their city's manic growth not just as an economic boom, but as a moral and historical destiny. They were, in their own eyes, the builders of a new Rome, the architects of the American future. An 1868 visitor described the city's ethos. There is no limit to the praise which a Chicagoan bestows upon his city. He sees that it has a great future. He believes that it will be the greatest city on the continent and that it will surely be the center of the United States. This wasn't just confidence. It was a secular faith, a belief that through sheer force of will and commerce, they could conquer nature itself. They even undertook the monumental task of physically lifting the entire city by 4 to 14 feet in the 1850s and 60s, using thousands of jack screws to raise buildings, sidewalks, and streets out of the mud to install a proper sewage system. The feat was an engineering marvel, a testament to their audacity. Nothing, it seemed, was impossible for Chicago. But this very audacity, this belief that they could outbuild and outpace any problem, was planting the seeds of their own destruction. To accommodate its explosive growth, Chicago needed to be built quickly and cheaply. The most abundant and affordable resource available was lumber, harvested from the seemingly endless forest to the north. As a result, 1871 Chicago was overwhelmingly a city made of wood. This wasn't just a matter of a few wooden houses. The entire urban fabric was wooden. Of the city's roughly 60,000 structures, a full two-thirds were made entirely of wood. Many of these were built using a new revolutionary technique that had been pioneered, ironically, right there in the Chicago area: balloon frame construction. Traditional timber framing required heavy posts and beams, joined together by skilled carpenters. The balloon frame, however, used lightweight, pre-milled 2x4 studs, held together with cheap, mass-produced nails. A house could be framed and erected in a matter of days by a handful of semi-skilled laborers. It was the perfect technology for a city in a hurry, but it was also horrifically flammable. The technique created hollow spaces between the studs that ran uninterrupted from the foundation to the attic. During a fire, these spaces acted as perfect chimneys, sucking flames upward and through the entire structure in a matter of minutes, often before the occupants even knew their house was on fire. The wooden construction extended to every conceivable surface. The roofs were covered with wooden shingles, often coated with highly flammable tar for waterproofing. The magnificent mansions of the city's elite were adorned with ornate wooden cornices, porches, and cupolas. Even the city's infrastructure was flammable. The sidewalks were made of thick wooden planks, raised several feet off the ground to keep them out of the mud. Over time, the spaces beneath these sidewalks became filled with an accumulation of trash, stray wood shavings, dry leaves, and coal dust, a hidden, continuous fuse of combustible debris running for miles throughout the city. Many of the sewer lines were made of wood, bridges were wood, the fences were wood. The city's very industries were temples to combustion. The south and west sides were dominated by lumber yards, where millions of board feet of seasoned pine, lumber rich with flammable resin, were stacked in towering air-dried piles. There were furniture factories filled with wood, varnish, and sawdust, distilleries filled with flammable alcohol, chemical plants, paint factories, and dozens of coal yards, holding mountains of the fuel that powered the city's engines. The Chicago River, the city's central artery, was often covered with an oily industrial slick littered with floating debris and stray logs. It was less a fire break than a flammable moat. Even in the downtown business district, the so-called fireproof buildings were a dangerous illusion. While these grand structures were faced with limestone, marble, or brick, their interiors were a different story. The floors, partitions, rafters, and staircases were all made of wood. They were essentially stone ovens filled with flammable fuel. The city government was aware of the danger. A system of fire limits existed, which theoretically restricted wooden construction in the central business district. But these laws were inconsistently enforced, riddled with loopholes, and often ignored entirely under pressure from powerful real estate developers who prioritized profit over prudence. In 1871, driven by the need to rebuild quickly after a smaller fire, the city council had even temporarily suspended the fire limits, allowing contractors to erect wooden buildings right in the heart of the city. One alderman prophetically warned his colleagues, "When the next great fire comes, it will lay a large portion of the city in ashes. Let the responsibility rest where it belongs." His warning was ignored. Every decision made in the name of speed and growth had added another layer of fuel to the pyre. Chicago was not just a city with fire hazards, it was a fire hazard. It was a single, sprawling, interconnected system of combustible material, waiting for the right conditions to ignite. And in the fall of 1871, those conditions arrived with a vengeance. Just as the physical city was a landscape of dangerous contrasts, of supposedly fireproof stone next to rickety pine, so too was its society. The wealth generated by Chicago's incredible economic engine was not distributed evenly. It created a rigid social hierarchy, a city of unimaginable opulence existing side by side with desperate poverty. This social friction created its own kind of combustible atmosphere, one thick with resentment, prejudice, and fear. At the top of the pyramid was a powerful and tightly knit elite of native-born, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant business tycoons. Men like Marshall Field, the department store magnate, George Pullman, the sleeping car inventor, and Potter Palmer, the real estate baron. They were the city's unofficial royalty. They built palatial mansions of stone and wood along the grand avenues of the south and north sides, filled them with European art, and conducted their business and politics in exclusive gentlemen's clubs. They saw themselves as the rightful stewards of the city's destiny, paragons of Victorian virtue, hard work, and sobriety. Beneath them, and providing the labor that fueled their fortunes, was a massive and diverse immigrant working class. Chicago was a city of immigrants. By 1870, half of its population had been born outside of the United States. The largest group was the Germans, who settled primarily on the north side. They were known for their skilled trades, their love of music and beer gardens, and their active participation in political movements, including socialism. The second largest group was the Irish. Fleeing famine and poverty in their homeland, they arrived in Chicago with little more than the clothes on their backs. They took the hardest, most dangerous, and lowest-paying jobs, digging canals, working in the slaughterhouses of the Union stockyards, and laboring in the lumber yards. They were concentrated in crowded, poorly built tenement neighborhoods on the west and south sides, in areas with names like Conley's Patch. The city was further populated by large communities of Scandinavians, Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes, as well as English, Scottish, and a growing number of Bohemian immigrants. The ruling elite viewed this immigrant population with a mixture of necessity and deep suspicion. They were the essential workforce, the muscle of the city. But they were also seen as foreign, unruly, and morally suspect. Their languages were strange, their customs were different, and in the case of the Irish and many Germans, their Catholic faith was viewed with hostility by the Protestant establishment. They were blamed for crime, for political corruption, and especially for what the elite saw as a culture of rampant alcoholism. The temperance movement was strong among Chicago's upper class, who saw the immigrant saloon as the root of all social evil. These tensions were not just abstract. They played out in the city's politics and law enforcement. The elite constantly sought to impose their cultural values on the working class, leading to clashes like the Lager Beer Riot of 1855, when the mayor tried to close saloons on Sundays. This social divide created a deep well of us versus them mentality. To the wealthy residents of Prairie Avenue, the immigrant neighborhoods of the West Side were a different world, a chaotic, dirty, and dangerous place populated by people who were fundamentally other. It was this deeply ingrained prejudice that would make it so easy, so natural, for the city to later seek a scapegoat from that very world. When the fire came, it would not just be the physical city that was tested, but its social fabric as well. And in that test, the city's ugliest instincts would be laid bare. The year 1871 was unnaturally, terrifyingly dry. From the beginning of July until the fire in October, a period of over 3 months, less than an inch of rain fell on Chicago. The normal average for that period was closer to 9 inches. A persistent high-pressure system had settled over the Great Plains, deflecting storm systems away from the region. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down from a cloudless sky, baking the city. The surrounding prairies turned brown and brittle. Wells ran low. The Chicago River became sluggish and shallow. The wooden city, under this constant solar assault, began to cure like timber in a kiln. The moisture was baked out of every wooden shingle, every plank of the endless sidewalks, every 2x4 stud in every balloon frame house. The city became brittle, resinous, and explosively flammable. The air itself was different, filled with a fine dust from the parched landscape and the ever-present soot and coal dust from the city's industries. The slightest spark could ignite a blaze, and the sparks came. The fall fire season of 1871 was brutal. In the weeks leading up to the Great Conflagration, the Chicago Fire Department was run ragged, racing from one serious fire to the next. They were a brave and professional force, led by Fire Marshal Robert A. Williams. But they were critically undermanned and under-equipped for the scale of the city and the extremity of the conditions. Then came the omen. On the night of Saturday, October 7th, the night before the Great Fire began, a massive blaze broke out in a planing mill on the west side. Fanned by the same strong southwesterly winds that would prove so deadly 24 hours later, the fire raged for nearly 10 hours. It jumped from building to building, consuming 4 entire city blocks and destroying millions of dollars in property. It was a massive fire by any standard, one that would have been the biggest fire of the year in any normal year. The entire Chicago Fire Department was called out to fight it. They battled the flames all through the night and into Sunday morning, deploying nearly every engine and every foot of hose they owned. The men were pushed to the point of physical collapse. Their steam-pumping engines were battered, and much of their equipment was damaged. By the time they finally brought the Saturday night fire under control on Sunday, they were utterly exhausted. The men went back to their stations to clean their equipment and try to catch a few precious hours of sleep. They were a spent force, having just fought their great fire. They had no way of knowing that the real apocalypse was less than 12 hours away. The city of Chicago on Sunday, October 8th, 1871, was a bomb that had been meticulously assembled over decades. The explosive material was the wood, millions of tons of it, dried to a crisp by a historic drought. The social and political negligence provided the perfect casing, ensuring that no meaningful safety measures were in place. The prologue of the Saturday night fire had exhausted and crippled the city's only defense. All that was needed now was a fuse. All that was needed was a single insignificant spark in the wrong place at the wrong time on a night when a devil wind was blowing from the southwest. As the sun set that Sunday, all the elements of doom had perfectly, tragically aligned. The curtain was about to rise on one of the greatest disasters in American history, and so the stage was set for a tragedy of epic proportions. Decades of prioritizing profit over prudence had transformed Chicago into a sprawling tinderbox, a city built of dry wood and simmering social tension. A historic drought had baked it brittle, and a fire the previous night had left its defenders exhausted and depleted. As an uneasy Sunday evening fell on October 8th, 1871, all of the ingredients for a historic catastrophe were in place. All that was missing was a single spark, a seemingly insignificant flame in a forgotten corner of the city, to ignite the waiting pyre and unleash an inferno that would test the limits of human endurance. On the evening of Sunday, October 8th, 1871, an uneasy twilight settled over Chicago. The city was weary. The fire crews, shattered from their battle against the blaze the night before, were trying to steal a few moments of rest. For the citizens, it was the end of a long, dry, and dusty Sabbath. But there was no peace in the air. A relentless wind, hot and dry as a blast from a furnace, howled in from the southwest, rattling window panes and kicking up choking clouds of dust from the unpaved streets. It was a nervous, agitated wind, a wind that spoke of bad things to come. Chicago was a city primed for catastrophe. It was a physical tinderbox of dry wood, a social tinderbox of class and ethnic tension, and a city whose defenses against its oldest foe, fire, were at their absolute weakest. The great bomb had been built over decades of hubris and haste. Now all it lacked was a fuse. That fuse was about to be lit in the humblest of places, a place of hay and animals, in a forgotten corner of the sprawling immigrant West Division. What began as a flicker in the dark would, within hours, become a roaring beast of unimaginable fury, an inferno that would unmake a city. The neighborhood west of the Chicago River South Branch was a dense, tangled labyrinth of working-class life. It was a district of small wooden cottages, crowded tenements, lumber yards, planing mills, and coal depots, all packed together along narrow, unpaved streets. This was where much of the city's heavy lifting was done, and it was home to a large population of Irish immigrants. It was here, at 137 DeKoven Street, that the O'Leary family lived. Catherine O'Leary was, by all accounts, a hard-working and respectable woman. She and her husband Patrick had emigrated from County Kerry in Ireland, and through years of toil had managed to buy their small plot of land and build a 2-story wooden cottage. To supplement Patrick's income as a laborer, Catherine ran a small dairy business, owning 5 cows which she milked daily and a horse and wagon for deliveries. She was known to be a good neighbor, but in the nativist atmosphere of Chicago, she was still defined by her status. She was poor, she was female, and she was Irish. She was, in the eyes of the city's elite, part of the other. The famous legend, of course, places her in her barn at around 9 p.m., milking a cow that, irritated, kicked over a lantern and ignited the hay. It is a simple, compelling image, but it is almost certainly false. As Catherine would testify under oath and maintain for the rest of her life, the entire family had been exhausted from the day and had gone to bed early. The story of the fire's discovery begins not with Mrs. O'Leary, but with a neighbor who lived across the street, a man named Daniel Peg Leg Sullivan. Sullivan, who had a wooden leg, claimed that he was sitting on the wooden sidewalk in front of his home when he saw flames suddenly erupt from the O'Leary's barn. He shouted, "Fire!" and, by his own account, ran about 200 feet to the barn, heroically attempting to untie the frantic animals inside before the heat drove him back. He then claimed to have run down the block to raise the alarm. For a century, his story was taken as the heroic counterpoint to Mrs. O'Leary's supposed negligence. But modern historians, most notably Richard Bales, have cast serious doubt on Sullivan's testimony. Could a man with a wooden leg truly have run so far, so fast, through dark and cluttered yards? Or was his story an elaborate cover for a more direct and perhaps accidental involvement? It is a question history may never definitively answer. What is certain is that chaos erupted quickly. As Sullivan shouted, another neighbor, William Lee, ran to Bruno Gold's drugstore at a nearby intersection, which housed fire alarm box 295. He pulled the lever, sending a telegraph signal to the Central Fire Watch office located in the tower of the city courthouse. Here, the first of many catastrophic failures occurred. In the watchtower, fire watchman Matthias Schaffer also spotted the blaze. Looking southwest from his high perch through the smoke and haze still lingering from the previous night's fire, he made a disastrous miscalculation. He judged the fire to be at the corner of Canalport Avenue and Halsted Street, a full mile southwest of the actual location on DeKoven Street. He immediately telegraphed his incorrect location down to the fire dispatcher, who in turn sent the first responding companies racing in the wrong direction. As the crucial first minutes ticked by, the engines and hose carts of the Chicago Fire Department were galloping away from the fire, not towards it. The O'Leary barn and the neighborhood surrounding it were on their own. By the time the alarm from the drugstore box was correctly interpreted and the first engine, the steam pumper America of Engine Company 6, finally arrived at DeKoven Street, the fire was no longer a barn fire. It was a monster. The flames, whipped into a frenzy by the gale-force southwesterly wind, had already consumed the O'Leary's entire property and had leaped across the narrow alley, engulfing the neighboring wooden cottages. The heat was so intense that the firemen could barely get close enough to unlimber their hoses. This was no ordinary fire. The combination of the drought-cured wood and the powerful wind created a terrifying new dynamic. The wind was not merely fanning the flames, it was acting as a giant bellows, superheating the air and creating a powerful convection column that rose thousands of feet into the sky. This column was filled with burning debris, not just sparks and embers, but entire flaming planks, chunks of roofing, and blazing shingles. These firebrands were carried aloft and then hurled by the wind hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet ahead of the main fire, starting dozens of new fires, far beyond where the firefighters were trying to make a stand. This phenomenon, known as spotting, made traditional firefighting methods completely useless. It was impossible to surround a fire that was constantly starting new versions of itself a quarter of a mile away. The residents of the neighborhood were thrown into a state of primal panic. Families were separated in the smoke and confusion. People rushed from their homes with whatever meager possessions they could carry, a mattress, a trunk, a religious icon. The narrow streets became choked with fleeing people, screaming children, and horse-drawn wagons piled high with furniture, all struggling to move against the stream of arriving fire engines. The roar of the fire was a constant deafening sound, punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and the occasional explosion from a stored barrel of kerosene. Fire Marshal Robert Williams arrived on the scene and immediately grasped the horrifying scale of the disaster. He saw that the fire was already far too large for the initial responders. He sent riders to pull more alarm boxes, summoning every available engine in the city to the West Division. His strategy was to try and form a defensive line to get ahead of the fire and douse the buildings in its path with water to prevent it from spreading. But the fire's speed and the constant spotting made this impossible. Every time his men set up their pumpers and aimed their hoses, the fire would simply leap over their heads, appearing behind them and forcing them into a panicked retreat. They were not fighting the fire, they were being herded by it. One firefighter later described the futility of their efforts. We would get a stream of water on a building and think we had it under control when the building next to it and the one next to that would suddenly burst into flames from the roof down. It was as if the fire was raining down from the sky. The men were exhausted, their faces blackened by soot, their hands blistered from the heat. They were battling an enemy that obeyed no earthly rules. The fire, now a solid wall of flame several blocks wide, began its relentless march northeastward, pushed directly by the wind toward the heart of the city. Its path was a cross-section of the West Division's diverse industrial landscape. It consumed block after block of working-class homes. It devoured Conley's Patch, one of the city's most notorious Irish shanty towns, wiping it from existence in minutes. It roared through lumber yards, the stacked pine exploding into pillars of fire. It set the city's massive gasworks ablaze, sending a terrifying fireball hundreds of feet into the air and plunging the surrounding neighborhoods into darkness, illuminated only by the horrific orange glow of their own destruction. By 11:30 p.m., the fire had become a true firestorm. The science of this phenomenon is terrifying. The massive column of superheated air rising from the blaze created a powerful vacuum at its base. This vacuum began sucking in air from all directions, including from above at hurricane speeds. This inflow of oxygen fed the flames, increasing their temperature to well over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt iron and glass. It also created its own bizarre and violent weather patterns. Eyewitnesses described fire devils, whirling tornadoes of flame that would detach from the main blaze, dance down streets, and capriciously consume one building while leaving its neighbor untouched. The sound changed from a roar to a deep, unholy moan, a sound that many survivors said they could never forget. The heat was unbearable, even blocks away. It was a self-sustaining, self-perpetuating thermal engine of almost unimaginable power. Marshal Williams and his exhausted crews made their last desperate stand as the fire approached the south branch of the Chicago River. In the minds of everyone, firefighters and fleeing citizens alike, the river was the ultimate fire break. It was a wide, watery barrier that surely the flames could not cross. If they could just hold the fire on the west bank, the rest of the city, the rich and powerful South Division with its banks, hotels, and government buildings, could be saved. They positioned their steam pumpers along the riverbank, drawing water directly from the river and pouring everything they had onto the warehouses and factories lining the western shore. But it was a futile gesture. The radiant heat from the approaching firestorm was so intense that it caused buildings on the east side of the river to smolder and then burst into flame even before a single ember had crossed. The paint on the fire engines began to blister and peel. The firefighters themselves were driven back, forced to abandon their positions or be cooked alive They could only watch in horror and disbelief as the firestorm reached the river's edge, not to be stopped, but merely to pause and gather its strength for the final, fatal leap. Around 1:30 a.m. on Monday, October 9th, the impossible happened. The convection column, now a roaring chimney of superheated gas and burning debris, was so powerful that it easily lifted thousands of flaming projectiles high into the sky and carried them across the river. A large burning piece of timber from a factory roof sailed through the air like a missile and landed on the flammable tar roof of the Parmalee Omnibus and Stage Company's stables, located on the supposedly safe eastern bank. Almost simultaneously, a shower of embers ignited the shingled roof of a small wooden shack nearby. The fire was across the river. It was now in the South Division. This was the moment the battle for Chicago was truly lost. It was the strategic equivalent of an enemy army appearing, fully formed, behind your last line of defense. The city's command structure, already on the verge of collapse, now shattered completely. Marshal Williams and the bulk of his forces were still engaged in a losing battle against the original fire, which was still raging through the West Division. Now, a second independent and equally ferocious fire had been born in the city's commercial and political heart. There were not enough men, not enough engines, and not enough water to fight a war on two fronts. The South Division was where Chicago kept its treasure and its pride. This was the landscape of Potter Palmer's magnificent Palmer House Hotel, the grandeur of the Field and Lighter department store, the splendor of the Crosby Opera House, the offices of the Chicago Tribune, and the towering Cook County Courthouse with its great bell. These were the symbols of the city's wealth, culture, and power. And many of them were, as we know, fire traps masquerading as fortresses. As the fire took hold in the stables and shacks on the East Bank, it found a new, rich source of fuel. This was the world of grand hotels filled with fine carpets and wooden furniture, of newspaper offices filled with paper and ink, of theaters with their wooden stages and flammable curtains. The fire, which had been born in a humble immigrant's barn, was now about to feast on the palaces of the city's kings. The worst, by far, was yet to come. The city's night of terror had only just begun. The first battle was lost almost as soon as it began. Despite the heroic efforts of its firefighters, the firestorm that erupted from the O'Leary barn proved to be an unstoppable force, laying waste to the immigrant neighborhoods of the West Division. The city's primary defense, the Chicago River, became not a barrier, but a gateway. As flaming debris sailed across the water, a second, even more terrifying blaze was born in the city's commercial and political heart. The fire was no longer a localized disaster, it was now a two-front war, and the grand, supposedly fireproof palaces of the South Division were directly in the path of a hellscape with an unquenchable appetite. Midnight in Chicago, October 9th, 1871. This was the turning point. This was the moment a great urban fire transformed into something else entirely, a conflagration of mythic proportions. As we recounted in Part 2, the Inferno, born in the immigrant quarters of the West Division, had performed the impossible. Driven by a hurricane-force wind of its own creation, it had leaped across the south branch of the Chicago River. It was no longer a fire in Chicago. The fire was now at war with Chicago. The city's exhausted and battered fire department was now caught in an impossible trap. Behind them in the west, a square mile of the city was still burning furiously. Before them, a new, independent blaze was now taking root in the South Division, the city's very heart. This was the central nervous system of Chicago's commerce, culture, and government. It was a landscape of multi-story buildings, grand hotels, and opulent theaters, the very symbols of the city's indomitable pride. Marshal Williams and his men were now facing a two-front war. They had no hope of winning. What was about to unfold in the next few hours would be not a battle, but a slaughter. The systematic, terrifying annihilation of one of the proudest city centers in the world. The fire did not creep into the South Division. It exploded into it. Landing first in the flammable shacks and stables near the river, it found a smorgasbord of fuel. It immediately raced towards the South Side Gas Works, a sprawling complex of tanks and pipes. The ensuing explosions sent massive fireballs into the night sky, shattering windows for blocks around and sending a shower of burning debris across the adjacent neighborhoods. The blasts acted like a signal, a terrifying announcement to the entire city that the river had been breached and that no place was safe. Now the fire began its inexorable march into the commercial district, and the great lie of 19th century architecture was about to be exposed. For years, Chicago's builders had boasted of their magnificent fireproof buildings. They were constructed with thick stone or brick facades, iron columns, and cast iron ornamentation. They looked solid, permanent, eternal, but they were a fatal illusion. One of the first major tests was Potter Palmer's new hotel, the Palmer House. It was the jewel of the city, a brand new 8-story marvel that had just opened 13 days earlier. Palmer had spent a fortune, nearly $3 million, to make it the most luxurious and the safest hotel in the world. It was advertised as thoroughly fireproof, but as the inferno approached, the building's weaknesses were laid bare. The radiant heat from fires across the street was so intense that the fireproof building's windows shattered. Embers, carried on the superheated wind, blew into the opulent rooms, igniting the velvet curtains, the plush carpets, and the fine wooden furniture. The fire began to consume the hotel, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. In less than an hour, the Grand Palmer House, the symbol of Chicago's luxurious future, was a gutted, roaring furnace. This story was repeated all over the downtown area. The fire, moving with terrifying speed, swept down the grand commercial streets, LaSalle, Clark, Dearborn. It devoured the 5-story Booksellers Row, a landmark filled with countless volumes of flammable paper. It found the city's cultural heart, the district of grand theaters. The Crosby Opera House, a magnificent structure that had survived a previous fire and was considered a fortress, was hollowed out by the flames. Its grand stage and velvet seats turned to ash. McVicker's Theater, Hooley's Opera House, all vanished. Next came Newspaper Row, the hub of the city's vibrant and competitive press. Here, journalists became the frontline correspondents of their own demise. At the offices of the Chicago Tribune, editor Joseph Medill and his staff worked feverishly by gaslight to get out one last extra edition, describing the apocalyptic scenes, even as the buildings around them caught fire. They wrote editorials calling for the dynamiting of buildings to create a firebreak, a desperate and ultimately useless idea. They only abandoned their posts when the floor of their own press room grew too hot to stand on, fleeing just minutes before the entire building was engulfed. The city's voice was being silenced. As the structures of commerce and culture fell, the structure of society began to fray. The initial shock among the residents of the South Division gave way to panic. Guests in the grand hotels, who just hours before had been watching the fire from their windows as a distant spectacle, now found themselves in the same desperate situation as the West Side immigrants they had been observing. They fled into the streets, a chaotic mix of the wealthy in their fine clothes and the hotel staff in their uniforms. But the streets were no longer safe. The order of the city was collapsing. With the police force overwhelmed and scattered, looting began. Store windows were smashed, and people, some driven by desperation, others by sheer opportunism, began to grab whatever they could from the burning shops. The fire was not just destroying buildings, it was stripping away the veneer of civilization. Amidst the roaring chaos of the burning South Division stood one building that, to the citizens of Chicago, represented permanence itself: the Cook County Courthouse and City Hall. It was a massive, imposing structure, 3 stories high, with a towering cupola and a deep, seemingly impregnable basement. Its walls were made of thick, solid Lamont limestone. If any building could survive this hellscape, people thought, it would be this one. The courthouse became a beacon of false hope. As the fire advanced, city officials and ordinary citizens alike began to flock to it, believing its stone walls offered sanctuary. They dragged priceless city records, deeds, tax rolls, court documents into its supposedly fireproof vaults. Wealthy individuals brought chests of silver and important papers, entrusting them to the building's care. The building became a strange sort of Noah's Ark, filled with the legal and financial DNA of the city. But the fire did not respect symbols. It laid siege to the courthouse like a medieval army. The intense heat from the burning buildings across the street caused the stone walls to crack and spall. The iron shutters on the windows, designed to keep fire out, buckled and warped in the heat, allowing embers to penetrate the interior. The building's great weakness, however, was its grand ornate wooden cupola, which sat atop the stone structure like a crown. Around 2 a.m., a flurry of burning brands carried on the firestorm's updraft landed on the cupola's roof. It began to smoke, and then, in a sight of ultimate horror for the onlookers below, it burst into flame. Housed within that cupola was the city's largest and most important voice, a massive 8,000-pound bell. For hours, its deep, resonant toll had been ringing out the alarm, a constant, somber heartbeat in the symphony of destruction. Now the fire consumed the very tower that held it. As the wooden supports burned away, the great bell held on, continuing to ring erratically as the structure around it collapsed. Finally, with a great groaning of stressed timbers, the bell tore free. It crashed down through the burning roof of the courthouse, plunging floor by floor through the heart of the building before finally coming to rest, silent at last, in the rubble of the basement. For the thousands watching from afar, that final silenced toll was the sound of their city's death. The tragedy of the courthouse held one final horrifying chapter. In the basement jail, a large number of prisoners, estimated by some to be nearly 200, were trapped. As the building above them became a roaring inferno, a desperate scene unfolded. A few brave officials, including the sheriff, risked their lives to unlock the cells, herding the terrified prisoners out into the burning streets. In the chaos, many prisoners simply fled into the night. It's believed most were saved, but the true fate of all of them, in a city where hundreds would soon be listed as missing, remains unknown. The symbol of justice had become a tomb. Having consumed nearly the entire South Division, the firestorm, still pushed by the relentless southwest wind, now approached its next great obstacle, the main branch of the Chicago River. This was a wider channel than the South Branch, and it was the last best hope for the thousands of residents in the North Division. If the fire could be stopped here, a vast residential area containing both the opulent mansions of the city's richest families and the dense neighborhoods of its German and Scandinavian working class could be saved. But the fire was no longer a terrestrial force, it was an atmospheric one. Its path was now determined less by the streets and buildings below and more by the cyclonic winds it generated. And directly in its path on the north bank of the river stood the single most important strategic asset in the entire city, the Chicago Water Works. The waterworks, with its iconic castle-like water tower, was the heart that pumped life-giving water through the city's arteries. Its powerful steam-driven pumps drew immense volumes of water from Lake Michigan and pushed it under high pressure into the network of water mains that fed every fire hydrant in the city. As long as the waterworks stood, the fire department, however battered, still had a weapon. If it fell, they would have nothing. Just before 3:30 a.m., the citizens and firefighters holding a desperate line along the river's north bank watched in utter terror as the fire performed its second impossible leap of the night. A massive flaming piece of the roof from a burning warehouse in the South Division was lifted high into the air by the firestorm's updraft. It sailed, a terrible meteor of burning wood and tar, clear across the main branch of the river. It landed directly on the slate and timber roof of the waterworks' main pumping station. The building's roof immediately caught fire. The men inside, the heroic engineers who had stayed at their posts, tried to fight the flames, but it was hopeless. The fire spread quickly into the building's wooden interior, and soon the immense machinery, the very heart of the city's defenses, was engulfed. The giant pumps sputtered, groaned, and then fell silent. All across Chicago, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. At every fire hydrant where the beleaguered crews were making a stand, the powerful jets of water that were their only weapon dwindled to a pathetic trickle and then stopped entirely. The city's water supply was dead. A collective groan of despair rose from the firefighters. They were now weaponless, helpless spectators to their city's final agony. The fire had not just outmaneuvered them, it had decapitated their command and broken their sword. The iconic water tower itself, being made of solid stone, would famously survive the blaze, but its machinery, its entire reason for being, was a molten ruin. With the fall of the waterworks, all hope of saving the North Division vanished. There were no more rivers, no more fire breaks, and now no more water. The fire roared into this vast residential area, a district containing a third of the city's population, with absolutely nothing to slow its advance. The North Division was a place of extreme contrasts. Along the lakefront and on the grand avenues were the sprawling mansions of the city's industrial titans, the McCormicks, the Arnolds, the Ogdens, surrounded by lush gardens and private parks. Just a few blocks inland, however, were densely packed neighborhoods of small wooden cottages, home to thousands of German and Scandinavian immigrant families. The fire showed no prejudice. It consumed the palace and the hovel with equal democratic fury. It swept through the wealthy neighborhood of McCormickville, where the grand homes of the city's elite, filled with priceless art, libraries, and furniture, were vaporized. William Bross, the publisher of the Tribune and the state's former lieutenant governor, could only stand on a distant bridge and watch, helplessly, as his own magnificent home with its library of thousands of books was swallowed by the flames. The fire then moved into the dense immigrant neighborhoods. Here, the destruction was not a matter of individual buildings falling, but of entire city blocks being erased in a single roaring wave of flame. The scene was one of utter, indescribable panic. The wooden sidewalks, ignited from below by the debris that had collected there for years, were now on fire, forcing fleeing residents to run through gauntlets of flame. The bridges leading out of the area became scenes of horrific bottlenecks, as thousands of terrified people, many of them women and children, tried to force their way across. The only refugees were Lincoln Park, far to the north, and the sandy beaches of Lake Michigan. Thousands of people fled to the lakefront, a terrified, shivering mass of humanity huddled at the water's edge. Some waded into the cold lake water to escape the suffocating heat. They watched as a solid wall of fire, miles wide, consumed their entire world. From their vantage point, it looked as if the whole world was on fire. One survivor wrote, "It seemed as if the whole city was being licked up by a fiery tongue." By dawn on Tuesday, October 10th, the fire had largely burned itself out in the north, having finally run out of fuel at the edge of the still unsettled prairie. The sun rose on a scene of almost impossible devastation. The city of Chicago, the proud, bustling, arrogant phoenix of the prairie, was gone. In its place was a smoking 4-square-mile ruin, a flat, black, and silent landscape of rubble, punctuated only by the occasional skeletal stone wall of a ruined building. The fire had consumed the west, south, and north divisions. It had destroyed the city's economy, its government, and its homes. 100,000 people were now homeless refugees in their own city. The Great Fire was over, but the human tragedy was only just beginning. Through a long night of terror, the fire had proven itself to be the absolute master of Chicago. It had devoured the city's heart, silenced its government, choked off its water supply, and erased a vast sea of homes, rich and poor alike. As the dawn of Tuesday, October 10th, broke over a smoldering, unrecognizable ruin, the great roar of the inferno finally gave way to an eerie silence. The physical destruction was nearly complete, but the human story was just beginning. For the 100,000 dazed and homeless survivors, the challenge shifted from escaping the flames to surviving the cold, barren reality of the city of ashes. Narrator, Dawn, Tuesday, October 10th, 1871. The fire, having devoured everything in its path, had finally starved at the edge of the open prairie. The roaring beast of the past 36 hours had fallen silent. In its place was a profound and unnerving quiet, broken only by the crash of a distant collapsing wall or the whistling of the wind. The air, thick and acrid with the stench of wet ash, charred wood, and something indefinably worse, was cold. A light, miserable drizzle had begun to fall, turning the endless acres of gray ash into a thick, black paste. As we recounted in Part 3, the inferno had performed a terrifying act of erasure. It had scoured the commercial, political, and social heart of Chicago from the face of the earth. But the end of the flames was not the end of the tragedy. It was merely the end of the first act. For the 100,000 people now huddled on the cold, damp ground of the city's parks and prairies, homeless, penniless, and shell-shocked, a new and different kind of ordeal was just beginning. The fight against the fire was over. Now began the desperate struggle for survival in the city of ashes, and a bitter battle for the very soul of Chicago's future. As the sun struggled to pierce the thick pall of smoke, the true scale of the devastation was revealed. It was a scene of almost impossible obliteration. A swath of the city 4 miles long, and on average 3/4 of a mile wide, was simply gone. From the O'Leary's neighborhood onto Coven Street in the southwest, up through the entire central business district, and across the river to the northernmost edge of the city at Fullerton Avenue, the landscape was a uniform, smoldering black. The statistics were staggering, almost abstract in their immensity. Over 17,500 buildings had been destroyed. 73 miles of streets were now buried under rubble. The economic loss was conservatively estimated at over $200 million, a figure that, in today's terms, would be in the multiple billions, representing nearly a third of the city's entire property value. but no number could truly capture the totality of the loss. It was the loss of homes, of livelihoods, of a generation's worth of accumulated work. It was the loss of records, photographs, and family heirlooms, the erasure of 1,000,000 individual histories. Amidst this near-total destruction, a few almost miraculous survivors stood as lonely sentinels in the wasteland. Most famously, the Chicago Water Tower and its adjacent pumping station remained standing. Their thick limestone walls had resisted the flames, even as their internal machinery was destroyed. Their survival was a fluke of materials and luck, but they would immediately become a powerful symbol of endurance for the shattered city. The walls of St. Michael's Church in the German neighborhood and the Second Presbyterian Church in the South also stood, skeletal but defiant. And in a remarkable twist of fate, the grand mansion of Malin Ogden, a wealthy lawyer and the city's first mayor, survived untouched in the heart of the burnt-out North Division, an island of green in a sea of black. According to popular legend, its survival was attributed to the frantic efforts of family and friends who spent the night covering the house in wet blankets and fighting off embers with brooms. These few survivors only served to emphasize the totality of the destruction around them. The human landscape was even more grim. The 100,000 homeless were a city of refugees. They were scattered in makeshift camps in Lincoln Park to the north, on the open prairie to the west, and along the lakefront to the south. They were a perfect cross-section of the city's society, now united in their dispossession. The millionaire merchant, who had fled his mansion in his nightclothes, now sat on the wet ground next to the Irish laborer who had lost his tiny cottage. They had nothing. No food, no water, no shelter. The drizzle of rain was now turning to a cold, steady downpour, adding hypothermia to the list of dangers. They wandered through the smoldering ruins, searching for lost family members or hoping to find something, anything, salvageable in the basements of their former homes. But there was nothing. The fire had been too complete. One survivor, Anna E. Higginson, later wrote of the scene, 100,000 people were burned out. Not a church, not a newspaper, not a theater, not a bank, not a wholesale store, scarcely a hotel left, all gone. In the hours and days immediately following the fire, a new and dangerous threat emerged: fear. With the government in shambles, City Hall destroyed, records burned, and officials scattered, and the police force completely overwhelmed, a power vacuum opened. And into that vacuum rushed paranoia, suspicion, and hysteria. The city was swept by wild and terrifying rumors. The fire, many began to insist, was no accident. It was a deliberate act of organized arson. This fear tapped into the deep anxieties of the era. The fire came just months after the bloody events of the Paris Commune in France, a working-class uprising that had terrified the propertied classes across the world. The rumor mill churned out stories that the fire was the work of communards, Reds, and other foreign radicals who, it was claimed, had infiltrated the city to destroy it from within. This political paranoia quickly merged with the city's pre-existing class and ethnic prejudices. The blame was placed squarely on the dangerous classes, the city's poor and immigrant populations. Stories circulated of organized gangs of Irishmen, called the firebugs, who were deliberately setting new fires. People claimed to have found incendiary devices in their homes. Anyone who looked poor, foreign, or was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time became a potential suspect. This mass hysteria led to the swift and brutal rise of vigilante justice. Believing they had been abandoned by the authorities, the city's respectable citizens took the law into their own hands. Ad hoc militias and vigilance patrols were formed, made up of armed businessmen, clerks, and veterans. They patrolled the boundaries of the burnt district, stopping and interrogating anyone who tried to enter or leave. The justice they dispensed was swift and merciless, horrifying stories, some certainly true, and others likely exaggerated by the panic, spread throughout the city. Terrifying rumors spread throughout the city, many later believed to be exaggerated. Stories told of a man found with matches in his pocket being shot on the spot, or another being hanged from a lamppost. While the panic was real, confirmed cases of such lethal vigilante justice are scarce. A reporter for the New York World wrote of seeing a man dangling from the arm of a lamppost on Clark Street with a placard on his breast which bore the brief but expressive legend, "A horse thief." The search for a scapegoat, which had begun with the quiet condemnation of Catherine O'Leary, had now exploded into open, murderous violence on the streets. It was a city at war with itself, a population terrorized not just by what they had lost, but by what they imagined was lurking in the shadows. Faced with the utter collapse of civil order, Mayor Roswell B. Mason was a man at the end of his rope. Operating from a temporary headquarters in a church on the west side, he received a constant stream of reports of looting, violence, and vigilante killings. He saw his city sliding into anarchy. Desperate, he made a decision that would restore order, but would also have profound and controversial consequences for years to come. On the afternoon of October 11th, he issued a proclamation that effectively surrendered control of his city. The preservation of the good order and peace of the city is hereby entrusted to Lieutenant General P.H. Sheridan, U.S. Army, the proclamation read. In an instant, Chicago was placed under a form of martial law. Lieutenant General Philip Little Phil Sheridan was one of the great heroes of the Union Army during the Civil War. A tough, aggressive, and utterly ruthless commander, famous for his scorched earth tactics in the Shenandoah Valley. After the war, he had become a commander in the brutal Indian Wars on the Great Plains. He was a man who understood order and was not afraid to use overwhelming force to achieve it. Stationed at the U.S. Army's division headquarters in Chicago, Sheridan acted with lightning speed. He immediately telegraphed for regular Army troops from as far away as Kansas and Nebraska. He organized the city's ex-soldiers into military-style patrols. He brought in companies of battle-hardened regulars who established checkpoints, enforced a strict curfew, and patrolled the streets with fixed bayonets. He also took control of the ongoing demolition efforts, using gunpowder to level still-standing ruins that were deemed a threat, the explosions echoing through the burnt city for days. The arrival of the troops had an immediate effect. The vigilante violence stopped. The rumors began to subside. A semblance of top-down military order was imposed on the chaos. But Sheridan's command was deeply controversial. The mayor of a city has no legal authority to declare martial law or hand control over to the federal military. That power is reserved for a state governor or the president, and only in cases of actual insurrection. What happened in Chicago was a controversial move that established a form of de facto martial law, though a formal legal declaration was never made. It set a dangerous precedent for the use of federal troops in domestic affairs, a precedent that would be invoked again in future labor disputes. For the city's elite, Sheridan was a savior. For the working class and immigrant populations, the sight of federal troops on their streets was a chilling reminder of who was truly in control. As Chicago descended into chaos, the telegraph wires hummed with the news of its destruction. Because of its central role in the nation's economy, the fire was not just a local story. It was a national and international catastrophe. and the world responded with a stunning outpouring of charity. From cities across the United States and Canada, and from as far away as London, Paris, and Berlin, aid began to flow towards the stricken city. St. Louis, Chicago's great rival city, was one of the first to respond, sending a train loaded with food, blankets, and an entire company of firefighters to relieve their exhausted Chicago comrades. New York City raised millions of dollars. Cincinnati sent steamboats full of supplies. The citizens of England sent a massive donation of books, which would become the foundation of the new Chicago Public Library. It was one of the greatest acts of global charity the 19th century had ever seen. The question was, what to do with it all? Mayor Mason, overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster and the sheer volume of donations, made his second fateful decision. He issued another proclamation directing that all relief funds and supplies be placed under the exclusive control of a single private organization, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society. On the surface, this seemed like a rational decision. The society was a pre-existing, well-organized charity, but its board of directors was a who's who of the city's most powerful and conservative business elite. Men like the sleeping car magnate George Pullman, the dry goods king Marshall Field, and the prominent banker Wirt Dexter. These men were believers in a rigid Victorian-era philosophy known as scientific charity. They held the deep-seated belief that poverty was a moral failing. They were convinced that indiscriminate charity, simply giving food or money to anyone who asked for it, would destroy the recipient's work ethic and encourage a permanent state of dependency. As the arbiters of the city's survival, they immediately put their philosophy into practice. They established a rigid bureaucratic system for distributing aid. To receive help, a victim had to register and be visited by an investigator from the society. They were subjected to a thorough, often humiliating interrogation about their work history, their moral character, their drinking habits, and their religious affiliation. Aid was not a right, it was a privilege to be earned by proving one's worthiness. This system was inherently biased against the very people who had lost the most. The skilled native-born Protestant mechanic who could prove his sobriety and work ethic was given new tools and a loan to rebuild his life. But the unskilled Irish Catholic laborer, the German widow with several children, or the single woman with no male provider was viewed with suspicion. They were the undeserving poor, and they were often denied meaningful aid or given only the barest of rations, lest they become lazy. The fire had leveled the city, momentarily making the rich and the poor equal in their status as refugees. But now, in the critical first days of the recovery, the old social hierarchy was being rebuilt with a vengeance. A small cabal of the city's wealthiest men now held the power of life and death over its 100,000 victims. The stage was set for the recovery to become an unprecedented exercise in social engineering, a chance for the city's elite to rebuild Chicago not just physically, but socially, in their own image. In the crucible of the fire's aftermath, a new and brutal order had been forged. With the city under the control of the U.S. Army and the fate of its 100,000 victims in the hands of an elite group of businessmen, the immediate chaos began to subside. But the struggle for survival was quickly evolving into a more complex battle for the future. The immense task of rebuilding was not just a matter of bricks and mortar. It was an unprecedented opportunity to reshape the city's very identity. Now, from the politics of relief and the ashes of the old world, the battle to define the new Chicago would begin. As we saw in Part 4, order was restored not by civil government, but by the bayonets of the United States Army. and the monumental task of relief was handed not to the people's elected representatives, but to a small private cabal of the city's wealthiest men, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society. The fire, in its indiscriminate fury, had acted as a great leveler, reducing rich and poor alike to the status of refugees. But now, in the critical decisions that would shape the city's future, the old rigid lines of class and power were being redrawn with a vengeance. The battle for survival was about to transform into a battle for the very soul of the new Chicago that would rise from the ashes. The question was no longer if the city would be rebuilt, but how, and more importantly, for whom. The men of the Chicago Relief and Aid Society saw themselves as saviors, but they were also social architects. Armed with millions of dollars in donations from a sympathetic world, they saw the disaster not just as a tragedy to be alleviated, but as a golden opportunity to impose their vision of a proper, orderly society on the chaotic, multi-ethnic city. Their guiding principle was scientific charity, a philosophy that mixed genuine compassion with a deep-seated distrust of the poor. Their goal was to create what they called the New Chicago, a city free from the perceived vice, idleness, and dependency of the old one. Their primary tool was the control of aid. They refused to give out direct cash assistance, believing the poor would only squander it on alcohol. Instead, they issued carefully controlled vouchers for specific goods, a bag of flour, a set of nails, a cheap blanket. To receive even this meager help, an able-bodied man was required to pass a labor test. He had to work for 10 hours a day on the city's rubble-clearing crews. It was a system designed to weed out the unworthy and instill the virtue of hard work in the deserving. This system had a profound and immediate impact on the city's physical and social geography. One of the most pressing problems was housing for the 100,000 homeless. The society's solution was the creation of thousands of identical bare-bones wooden shacks, which came to be known as relief shanties. But the location of these shanties was a deliberate act of social engineering. The society refused to allow them to be rebuilt in the burnt-out working-class neighborhoods of the city's core. They feared the recreation of the disorderly immigrant communities that had existed before the fire. Instead, they built the relief barracks far out on the barren prairie, miles from the city center. For those who wished to leave the city altogether, the society provided free, one-way railroad tickets to any destination in the country. Thousands, seeing no future in the ruined city, accepted. These policies had the effect of dispersing the city's poor and working-class population, pushing them to the geographical margins, or out of the city entirely. The valuable, now cleared land of the downtown and surrounding areas was thus preserved not for the people who had lived there, but for the commercial interests and real estate speculators who were already planning a grander, more profitable city. The fire had destroyed the old neighborhoods. The relief effort ensured they would never be rebuilt as they were. The segregation of modern Chicago had begun. While the Relief Society was reshaping the city's social landscape, an even more dramatic transformation was beginning in its physical one. The fire was an almost unimaginable tragedy, but it was also what the economist Joseph Schumpeter would later call an act of creative destruction. By wiping the slate clean, the fire created the largest and most concentrated construction project in the history of the world. It was a chance to rebuild an entire city center from the ground up, using new technologies and new ideas. The fire had been a brutal but effective teacher. It had revealed the fatal flaws of 19th century construction. The supposedly fireproof buildings with their stone facades had crumbled as the intense heat calcified the limestone and turned it to powder. Cast iron columns thought to be indestructible had softened and buckled in the inferno, bringing down entire buildings. There was a clear and urgent demand for a new way of building. Into this environment stepped a generation of brilliant, ambitious, and innovative architects and engineers who would become known as the Chicago School. They were pragmatists, not theorists, and they seized the opportunity to solve the problems the fire had created. At the forefront was an engineer named William LeBaron Jenney. His great innovation was to challenge the very idea of how a building supports itself. For centuries, the thick, load-bearing masonry walls of a building carried its weight. Jenney perfected the concept of using an internal skeleton, a rigid cage of iron, and later steel to carry the load of the floors and the exterior walls. This was a revolution. By freeing the outer wall from its load-bearing duties, it could become a mere curtain, allowing for much larger windows that let light deep into the building's interior. More importantly, because the metal skeleton was far stronger and lighter than solid stone, buildings could now soar to heights previously thought impossible. In 1885, Jenney's home insurance building, the first to be fully supported by a metal frame, rose 10 stories above the street. The modern skyscraper was born. Other architects brought an artistic vision to this new technology. The firm of Adler and Sullivan, led by the engineering genius Dankmar Adler and the brilliant mercurial architect Louis Sullivan, championed the philosophy of form follows function. They argued that a tall building should not be decorated like a classical palace, but should honestly express its height and its internal structure. Sullivan's ornate, nature-inspired terracotta ornamentation gave these powerful new structures a uniquely American and organic feel. He became the prophet of a new American architecture. Firms like Burnham and Root, led by the organizational mastermind Daniel Burnham and the artistic prodigy John Wellborn Root, perfected the creation of large, efficient, and breathtakingly beautiful commercial buildings. Their work, like the Rookery and the Monadnock Building, combined technical innovation with refined elegance, creating the template for the modern office building. Driven by the sky-high property values of the now empty downtown and the imperative to build fireproof, well-lit structures, these architects invented the modern city. In an incredible historical irony, the very event that had destroyed Chicago became the catalyst that made it the most architecturally advanced city in the world. It had lost its old wooden body, and in its place was growing a new skeleton of steel. This architectural and economic miracle, however, cast a long and dark social shadow. The rebuilding boom created a massive demand for labor, and tens of thousands of workers poured into the city. But the prosperity generated by their work flowed overwhelmingly to the top. The fire solidified the power and wealth of the city's business elite, who controlled the land, the banks, and the construction industry. The chasm between the rich and the poor, which had been a source of tension before the fire, became a gaping canyon after it. The working class, many of whom felt they had been treated with contempt by the Relief and Aid Society, watched as a new, grander city rose around them, a city in which they felt increasingly alienated. This simmering resentment fueled one of the most powerful and militant labor movements in American history. The great labor upheavals that would define late 19th century Chicago, the railroad strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair of 1886, the Pullman strike of 1894, all had their roots in the social divisions that were so cruelly exposed and then amplified by the fire and its aftermath. And what of Catherine O'Leary, the woman who had been unofficially blamed for it all? The official inquiry cleared her of any wrongdoing, but she was never cleared in the court of public opinion. The story of her cow was too simple, too satisfying, to be replaced by the complex truth of systemic failure. For the rest of her life, she was a pariah. Reporters and curiosity seekers hounded her, treating her not as a fellow victim, but as a freak show exhibit. She and her family moved to another part of the city and lived out their lives in quiet, defensive shame. She rarely left her home after dark and was said to have grown bitter and reclusive. When she died in 1895, the cause was acute pneumonia, but her family always believed she died of a broken heart. Her story remains the most poignant legacy of the fire, the tragic tale of an individual scapegoat forced to carry the sins of an entire city. Despite the injustices and the social scars, the story that Chicago chose to tell about itself was one of heroic, unqualified triumph. The speed of the recovery was, by any measure, a modern marvel. Within a year, thousands of new buildings had been erected. Within 3 years, the city's population and economy had surpassed their pre-fire levels. This incredible resilience was codified in a new identity for the city, captured by the motto, "I will." It was the spirit of a city that did not have time for sentimentality or self-pity. It was tough, pragmatic, and relentlessly focused on the future. The fire was incorporated into this new myth not as a moment of failure, but as a crucible, a trial by fire that had burned away the city's weaknesses and forged it into something stronger and greater. The grand culmination of this narrative came in 1893 with the World's Columbian Exposition. Just 22 years after it had been a smoking ruin, Chicago invited the entire world to a magnificent white city built on its lakefront. It was a spectacle of neoclassical architecture, technological marvels, and imperial confidence. It was the city's declaration to the world and to itself that it had not just recovered from the fire, but had triumphed over it. It was the final triumphant chapter in the story of the city that willed itself back into existence. The Great Chicago Fire is in the end more than just a story about a single disaster. It is a timeless and deeply American parable. It is a story about the terrifying speed of urban growth, about the collision between private ambition and public good. It is a story about how, in the wake of tragedy, the very best of human charity can exist alongside the worst of human prejudice. And it is a story that forces us to ask, whenever crisis strikes our own cities today, who will benefit from the rebuilding? Who will be empowered? And who will be displaced? Whose stories will be memorialized in stone and steel, and whose will be silenced and forgotten? The flames of 1871 were extinguished long ago, but the questions they ignited continue to burn. In the wake of the 1871 fire, a new Chicago emerged, a city of steel and stone, but also more deeply divided by class and race. The fire was not just a disaster, but a timeless lesson in the collision of individual ambition and the common good, where compassion and prejudice coexist. The old fire has died down, but the questions it ignited still burn. When crisis strikes, who benefits from rebuilding and whose stories are forgotten?